Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Homesteading Academy. We took a little bit of a break for the month of August, but we're happy to be back now. And I'm pleased to welcome Bill Bamka, who is my supervisor and also the co-creator of the Homesteading Academy. So we've been kind of sitting back and watching some of our colleagues come in and give presentations for the last year, but Bill's here today to talk about pasture management. Bill, why don't you go ahead and start your presentation?
All right, welcome everybody. For a lot of people, the reason we picked this topic is we are in one of the peak activity seasons for pastures right now. And this is when you should be doing a lot of things on your pastures. So I'm going to try to cover some of those things. Any questions, you can put them in chat. We'll go over them afterwards. And please mute if you go to sleep and you're snoring. So I'll try to make this as painless as possible. All right, so if we're looking at this is for some people, they think this is what a pasture should look like, right? Got a lot of good growth, a lot of grass that's there. This is what a lot of people are looking for. Obviously, this one's a horse pasture, but we can have pastures for, sheep, beef, and what we're going to cover is going to apply to pretty much all different livestock and equine. This is what you don't want when you're looking at your pasture, and got to stare at my shoes a little bit because, believe it or not, this was on the Rutgers campus. Okay, this was on our Equine Science Center prior to us doing a major renovation program, and we actually have an educational facility up there to show you what to do in terms of grazing management stuff. But the goal is not to have this. And if you look at this, it's overgrazed. You can see bare spots. So that's not what we're trying to get, obviously. Again, the reason I said we're talking about fall is for pastures, because there's a lot of things we can do in terms of fertility, overseeding, even for grazing management. We'll talk about a little bit, but this is possible. This pasture here is actually in New Jersey. It's a pasture that I worked with quite a while ago, and they practice rotational grazing, and the stocking density on this is a little bit higher than you would think by looking at this, but they are practicing rotational grazing as part of their grazing management. Okay, so what are the benefits of a good pasture? It's good low cost, high quality feed. And it's actually, you have to look at a pasture as just not an exercise area. It's actually a crop for you. It can supply some of the nutrients that your livestock needs, obviously. Soil and water conservation, which is becoming a bigger and bigger thing. You don't want stuff eroding, soil eroding from your pasture. You don't want nutrients leaving your pasture. So you want to have a dense, vigorous cover. And it provides an area for exercise, especially if we're in the equine areas. And there's an aesthetic value to it too. We like to see managed pastures. So what are some of those components of that good pasture? You want to make sure you have a tight, smooth sod, and that's going to come into picking some of the varieties that you're going to use in there. And bluegrass is going to be the big component to get us that tight, smooth sod. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but these are some of the things you're looking for when you're talking about a good pasture. It's got to be, like I said, palatable, nutritious. So if you plant something that the livestock's not going to eat, it's not going to be good to you. So a lot of times we'll pick species that are similar to the hay if you're feeding hay, and that's why you'll see a lot of our mixes have orchard grass in it, because it's a popular hay. No poisonous plants, and I'll talk about poisonous plants in a bit, but it's really a concern right now as we're in this dry drought period. Some of the plants that are in your pasture that could be green and more appealing might be poisonous plants. So I'll talk about, and I'll show you some resources to have on hand for identifying poisonous plants. But if you're going to be keeping livestock, horses, or anything like that, you really have a duty of care to at least know what some of the poisonous plants are that are common around here. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. And safe fences. You want to have safe fences to keep the livestock in and they're not going to get injured with. And you want it to be a large enough area, which we can talk about stocking density, and that's usually one of the biggest problems that we run into with our pastures. A lot of times we have too many animals for the size area that we have. And you want to make sure you have ample shade and water, and we'll talk a little bit about that, whether it's a run-in shed, you plant trees that are suitable, and waters that you have those in the area. So what I like to talk about, if we're talking about a pasture, and this is what I call the pasture triangle, and you really need all three of these to have a good, healthy, vigorous pasture. You want to make sure that you pick the right species for the area. You know, if you don't plant the right species, you're kind of be doomed to failure a little bit. You want to make sure your site conditions are good, as you know, look at your drainage, even your fertility. You know, low pH is a common one, and Kate and I have been out a couple times already where fertility is actually comes into play. That's one of the things in my 27 years here that can be easily corrected to help pastures, is maintaining the fertility. So we're going to put a good bit of emphasis on that because that's one of the quickest things you can do to turn around a pasture. And then we're going to look at our management. You know, are we grazing correctly? Are we mowing and clipping? Are we doing all the different things? So you have to have all those in place to get that healthy, vigorous pasture that you're looking for. And as I kind of said before, why didn't the previous stand persist? And going through it, these are some of the key reasons why they don't persist. Poor fertility. And if you're managing a pasture, you ask yourself, when's the last time I did a soil test? We'll talk a little bit about that. Am I overgrazing? And that actually hurts quite a bit because you stress the grasses that are in there. You stress the grasses, we start getting weeds coming in, and the pasture starts to take a slide from there. Are you picking the wrong forages for the region and the soil conditions? You know, based on your drainage, do you have the right species mix in there? Sometimes you'll see people trying to plant Bermuda grasses and things like that, which are really not adapted or well for us. But every once in a while, I'll hear a salesman, especially coming in South Jersey, saying, hey, plant this Bermuda grass, it'll do great. I'll give you some of the recommendations of where to go to get some of the stuff we want. But the reason I put some of these up there, if you don't address these things, you're going to be basically wasting your time. And the number one that we talk about is really the fertility, is the soil pH. And this is a great time to be spreading lime. But one of the mantras which we'll talk about is lime takes time. Okay, so if you have to do a liming application, it generally takes 6 months. So if you just now plant something and you have poor fertility, you might be dooming yourself to failure. So with that, I'm going to bring this question up for some people and think about this. Should you lime every year at the same time of the year? And I see this happen a lot in the home lawn arena, but it also happens like, you know, on pastures and things. And you shouldn't just lime for the sake of liming. You really want to lime based on a soil test. So the answer on this is, should you spread lime every year? No. Okay, you want to base it on a soil test. So you could be wasting money. Maybe you don't need to adjust your pH, or maybe you're not putting enough down. So we really need that soil test. All right, I throw this one up to see if anybody has an idea. But if you look at all these pastures, if you look at them, could you tell which one needs 25 pounds per acre potash and which one maybe needs 120 pounds of fertilizer there if you look at them? I can't. And the point I'm putting on this is you can see, looking at these, that there's grass growing. And if you look at the D one particularly, that one's overgrazed. So I don't know whether they're putting fertility down on that, but just looking at these pastures, you can't tell what the fertility needs are. And that's kind of the take home on one of these. You just can't look at something and tell whether it needs its pH adjusted. You can't tell by looking. You can, I guess the one on the D, you can get an idea what may be happening with the growth, but again, that's also a grazing management issue with that. So don't be just liming by the calendar, I guess is the take home on this. You want to make sure that you're basing everything you're doing on a soil test. And one of the things I try to tell people is, if you're looking at your pasture, this is actually a fertility experiment, but I took a crop here. If you see, this is corn. If you look on the left, right, it's lighter green. We all can recognize that that one's not doing well and might need some fertilizer. But I want to kind of get you in the mindset that your pasture is a crop also. Okay, so if you don't fertilize it, maintain it, you're not getting the growth that you could be getting out of it. So that's one of the things to keep in mind, is it's not just an area where I just put livestock out. If you're trying to use it as a forage and you're trying to help cut your expenses and things like that, think about it as a crop. And if you had a crop, you'd be out there fertilizing and maintaining it. Same thing goes with a pasture. So now I go again, is it possible to do this kind of pasture without managing your fertility? The answer to that is probably no. Fertility is going to play a big thing. And when we talk about fertility, soil pH goes along with that. That's part of our fertility. And that's usually the biggest problem that I see in a lot of the grasses and a lot of the pastures we're dealing with. And just to drive home that point a little bit, this is a survey, and I've done a similar type survey here in New Jersey. This one was out of Missouri, and they looked at 37 or 80% of the pastures they did a survey on. They went across and did a survey, and they showed that of those pastures, 80% of them had low or very low soil phosphorus levels. Okay, so that kind of drives home that point. People don't put the fertilizer down on it. Here in New Jersey, I haven't had the low P levels as much, only because a lot of the land we have has had a history of being farmed in manure applications. But if you also look at it in terms of potassium level, here 37% had low or very low in levels. And what's concerning about that is if you're growing any type of forage grass, a forage grass is a large consumer of potash. So to have that healthy, vigorous pasture, you want to make sure your potash levels are good. And if you look here at this one of the surveyed pastures, that also says the average soil pH was 5.8. That's where your grasses start to slow down and the weed pressure will start to increase. That's way too low of a pH to be growing pasture grasses. And a lot of times people don't lime their pastures. They just, it's really just a turnout area for some people. So this is an interesting thing. If you talk about you're looking at in terms of the soil pH and the fertility in terms of weed management. Again, that same survey Missouri had done back in 2015-16, they showed that a 1 unit increase in soil pH, they had 4,100 fewer weeds per acre by raising that pH. So if you think about it, that's actually a form of weed management for you. And what's happening there is you're getting the healthier grasses, and I'll show it a little bit later, but you're getting a more vigorous, dense grass that can actually compete. So by doing that, you're reducing your weed pressure. And if you look at it the same way, 1 part per million increase in either the P or the K, they had 162 or 12 fewer weeds per acre. The take-home point is if you feed the pasture the way it should be, you're going to reduce your weed pressure a little bit. So keep that in mind. This is always the controversial one. And I just throw this out here too. It's just like a lot of times we talk about animal density or animal units. Okay. A lot of times we don't really consider that. And that goes into renovation, management decisions, a lot of different things. And there's just a reality that if you have too high of an animal density, you're not going to be able to get the forage growth that you're thinking about. So, and we actually have a fact sheet that gives recommended animal, per acre. There's a rule of thumb about how many animal units per acre, and a lot of them come into, in terms of 1,000-pound animal units, 1 per acre, but there's deviations in that. But you have to look at yourself, and sometimes we even have too low of an animal density. If you're not clipping and maintaining the pasture, then it's going to get stemmy and it's not going to be a palatable, nutritious forage. So keep in mind, keep your expectations, I guess, realistic. You want to make sure that what you're doing is, is of a suitable density. If it's not, then you're never going to get that pasture that you're looking for. Again, just to show you again, the road to those poor pastures. Overgrazing is the other one besides soil fertility, which I pointed out, which can actually be a problem. Undergrazing, occasionally, but not really. The biggest one, as I said, is the overpopulation or the animal density. Or the other thing could be you pick poor species for a pasture. There are times that I've seen people put Timothy in a pasture, and that's not really a good thing for a pasture because the growing point on Timothy is above the soil surface. So you put an animal in there grazing, it's actually pulling at the growing point, which is going to actually reduce the density over time. So that's why if you put Timothy in a pasture, it doesn't persist that often. So you got to make sure when you're picking your species, you pick the right species for it. The other thing is we can get into some trouble with no weed control. Lately, I've been dealing with buttercup quite a bit. I've had a number of calls coming in on buttercup. Buttercup is one that can be, it takes a multi-pronged approach. It's usually because of your grazing management. It's also that we have to use different maybe herbicides for control, but it's not a one-shot deal. But we also try to use clipping to reduce the seed bank that goes in there. So anytime we're dealing with weed management, it's not just going in, spraying it, and then I'm done. Because if you're running into a lot of problems with weeds, it's probably an indication that your overall management of the pasture needs a little bit of tweaking. And I put the last thing here, letting nature take its course. Don't let that be your philosophy on pasture management, because a lot of people just plant and then they walk away from it. And that's kind of, you're guaranteeing that you're probably going to have a poor pasture if you don't do follow-up soil testing, you don't do maybe some overseeding, and we'll talk about some of the other things you can do. All right, so we are in the Northeast, and I put this here to show you that no one forage can actually satisfy, the entire season. There's actually different growth patterns. In the Northeast, we are in an area in New Jersey where we're predominantly with cool season grasses. And if you looked at this dashed line, it has a period early in the season where production is higher. It dips, which corresponds to our August period, late July period, where you don't get a lot of growth. If you think about mowing your home lawn, right, you might get away for a while without mowing because it's not growing as much. It's because we have cool season grasses. Then we get into the fall and we get a spike where we get an uptick in the growth. The yellow shows the growth patterns of the legumes, and the warm season grasses, again, they're going to that period where the cool season grasses shut down, the warm season grasses come on. Now, warm season grasses, we don't have a lot for where we are because they don't do that well. There are some that can be grown in the area, but it's generally not. So we're really dealing with just the cool season grasses and the legumes. As I said before, that it requires year-round attention to doing that pasture management. And the big thing is soil testing. And when I talk about that soil testing, make sure you're doing it every 3 or 4 years. And then you're going to be fertilizing annually. And we usually do in our area, we'll do a spring application of fertilizer. And that's usually like late March, like the last week in through the first like 15 days or so of April. And then we'll also do in the fall after grazing, which brings up a point. We're actually, for us, when we talk about fall is for planting and fall for pastures, it's really that last week or so of August into this period about now. That's when we're talking about. And unfortunately, a lot of the phone calls that I get for people who want to do planting or renovations, I get the phone calls in October, or and that's not the period of time. That may be where people are having fall festivals and that type of things, but that's not what we're talking about in terms of fall management in our pasture. Right now, we're in that peak season of doing fall management on the pasture. Okay, so I'm going to push you to do some soil tests. We're going to analyze, we're going to correct the deficiencies, and then we're going to get to a point. And one of the things that comes in a lot is it takes so much fertilizer, it takes so much fertilizer. Usually what ends up happening is because they've been neglected or you've never put fertilizer down. Initially, the fertilizer applications can be a little bit heavier to get it up to that optimum level. And then once you get to a maintenance level, it's not so bad. In terms of fertilizer too, this just shows it graphically. We get to a point where you're below optimum, and we want to get to that top line there where we hit the optimum. But if you look to the right where you see above optimum, there's really no benefit to that pasture. You're just spending money on resources that you don't need. And it could be a potential environmental liability if we get runoff, we get leaching or things like that. So your whole goal, and when we do the soil testing, that optimum range is what we're shooting for. In terms of the fertility, like I said before, we've done a number of studies, and it probably shows that a poorly managed pasture is actually turned around more by fertility than anything else. And I guess the second thing I would say would be grazing management after that. But if I can get you to get your fertility where it should be, or at least we're on the track to having better, a better pasture. And don't be doing things by the calendar. Like a lot of times people say, I got to put my lime down every fall, or we want you to do it by the soil test. And when we're doing fertilizer applications, we're looking at 2 fertilizer applications usually. Like I said, late spring and early fall. So that's kind of your your management calendar. So right now, if you have an established pasture, you should probably be putting down your fall fertilizers right now. In case you've never seen one, that is a soil test. You know, it's not beakers or anything like that. It's actually just a questionnaire with a really simple, you know, an envelope. We don't sell these in the office so much now. You can go online, you print out the questionnaire, you mail your sample up. But when you get that questionnaire and you fill that out, put some attention into that. You know, let me know whether or not you're picking manure, you're spreading manure. Those are all important considerations for managing the pasture, whether you're putting that down or not. So don't just send the sample in without answering that questionnaire, because the only one you're really hurting is actually yourself by doing that. All right. Again, I don't get any kickback or anything for this, but this is just to show you some of the economics of soil testing and why there's really, I don't think, a really valid reason for not doing one. Let's just say you have a 5-acre pasture. Soil test right now is $20. We recommend that you take a sample once every 3 years. So if you look at that, it's $1.33 per acre per year. I challenge you to get a cup of coffee for that price anymore. So that's really what you want to, you know, it's not that big of an expense. And I can share many horror stories with anybody if they want about people who have planted pastures this time of year and skip this step. And if your soil pH is too low, what's going to end up happening is the pasture is going to germinate. You're going to get, oh, it looks good. I got this nice little growth. And then all of a sudden it's going to turn to a lighter green. And then maybe it's going to be struggling a little bit. And I can tell you many examples where this has been the case, where people forgot this step of doing the soil test. And I've heard of people spending like $5,000 on hiring somebody to come in and do it, or a landscaper, and it failed because they didn't do this. So remember, that's $1.33 per acre per year. It's a small investment trying to ensure that you have good pastures. Here's the grabbing the soil test. And again, I'm kind of embarrassing ourselves, but that renovation I told you about on campus, this is what we started out with before we started with it. And this is what we had done. We went out there. The first step was collecting the soil samples. You can see I've got burdock in there. I've got some other problem weeds. It's overgrazed. So we were kind of embarrassed, and we did this, well, I can't even tell you how many years ago. It's got to be 15 or more years, that as a university, we should probably show people what to do. And there wasn't a lot of attention being placed on the pasture management. So we started this program to actually reinvigorate the pastures. We did that soil test. Here we are. You can see we did some of the liming on it. That was one of the first things that came back. They weren't really liming the pastures. So we got into a routine liming program with it. The other thing, which we'll talk about a little bit, is, especially if you're on the equine side, having a stress lot, or an area where it's, or some people might refer to it as a sacrifice area. If you have the animals out on pasture, you may not need or want them out there all the time. So what we do is we take one area, and I'll show you, which we keep them in just to have them outside, but where they're not like tearing up the grass, or they're not in an area like in the fall or in the winter where we're not having active growth, you know, where hooves and things like that can actually hurt the integrity of the pasture. And by allowing overgrazing, especially in the winter or fall months, if we have, like say, the one example is buttercup. If we're overgrazing, we're actually can be promoting, you know, the establishment of the buttercup in those areas. This we started to use, and this is, you can see more recently, but you can see the difference there, how we're starting to get grass coming back. And what we have here is temporary fencing. And it's one of the things that you might want to consider using when your grazing management plan. And what it does is it kind of makes the animals graze one area rather than being as more selective, and then you move them to another area with it. So we use temporary fencing routinely to try to get, you know, grazing and utilize the forage in an area before we move the livestock into another area. Okay, we talk about fertilizer and lime, and it's like I said, you can be out there. There's different ways of spreading fertilizer and lime. Okay, that put your nutrients out. You can have, like in the upper left, you have a tender there. You can have an ATV mount, And Kate and I have a joke there where the one on the bottom right, where you could even use, a push spreader if you have to, depending on the size. And don't forget, manure is also a fertilizer application. And there's different, this one here I've shown I use a lot with the people who have smaller acreages because they don't have, the capability, or they don't have a large spreader. There's smaller spreaders that can be even pulled by an ATV that are out there. So there's different ways of getting your fertilizer out across the field. And again, like I said before, you're managing a crop, and a crop needs to be fed. So that's why you want to make sure you have some way of getting that out there. If you're on a smaller operation, gate size comes into play a lot of times, if, especially for a commercial application, can they get in there, are the gates wide enough? And there's different requirements depending on what equipment they have. But generally, the smaller gates are a real problem. So then you're probably going to have the smaller equipment for yourself to get in. All right. Just showing you some of the nutrients that are going to be up there when you're talking about your pasture. We talk about major, secondary, micros. I'm not going to go into the fertility, but what I want to point out to you is a lot of people look at the micronutrients and they always think the micronutrients, that's what I'm lacking, are the most important thing. All of these elements are essential for plant growth. It's more of the quantity that they're needed in. So micronutrients can be limiting to your pasture growth just as much as a major nutrient is NP or K. So when you get that soil test, pay attention. Generally, I don't have very many problems with the micronutrients. In South Jersey, once in a while, because we have a sandier soil, we might have a boron requirement, but don't let anybody kind of sway you that one's more important to the other. They're all important for plant growth. All right, there's a soil test that you get back, and this causes lots of confusion, but that's why we have an extension office in each county. We can help you with this. If you look at this, it shows a pH of 5.7 on this. You get the bars in the middle, which tells you, where you are with the macronutrients. And you can actually take the calcium and magnesium levels to help you determine what lime is needed. You'll get a full report on this. If you're doing something for a pasture, at least in my county, they come across my desk. We look at them, we write the recommendations. Don't be afraid to go this, to call, ask for help or assistance on something like this, but that's what we're here for. But this is what you're going to get back. And a lot of people's eyes glaze over when they see this, and they don't understand it, and they don't know what fertilizer to use, but we kind of write down how much nutrients are needed, and then we can help guide you on whether you need a 10-10-10, a 10-6-4, but we can help, take some of the mystery out of that for you. And the reason we care so much about all that stuff is if we look at this bar shows the availability of nutrients. Now, most of your pastures are predominantly grasses, and we look at the width of these bars. They're the widest between the 6.5 to 7. That's where we get the maximum availability of the different nutrients. That's where we're getting it. So that's why we're shooting for that pH. If we get too low, we decrease the availability of some of the nutrients. If it gets too high, it can actually cause some problems. Getting above the 7 is really not encountered here. We're in the east. We're usually, and I just had one come across my desk where the pH was 5.4. I've had them as low as 5.2, and it's really going to inhibit your growth. And you'll hear something called aluminum toxicity when you start getting into the 5s, where it can actually start to kill the roots, which is not good. That's why your grasses are going to thin out, and then your weeds are going to start coming in. If you're looking for some guidance or some help, we actually have a bulletin on recommendations, what you should be looking at in terms of for your pastures. Our fertility specialist, Joe Heckman, wrote a really good bulletin on this. I encourage you to go to our publication section, pull it up if you're managing a pasture, and read through it. It will tell you about the importance of all the different nutrients and, when they need to be applied. This is a ryegrass. It's a demo just so we show, but this one has actually had lime, and applied in one where the pH was low. And you can look at the differences in the grasses, like in terms of being established in yield. The one on the left did not have the lime. It was a low pH. The one at the right had the pH corrected. You can notice how much more vigorous that grass is. It's there. So it does have a more of an importance than you think of when you're looking at it. All right, this goes back to my days as a graduate assistant. This is barley. And this was just to show you what's happening with your rooting depth. Okay, and barley is in the grass family. And you look at the different pHs, and you can obviously note when you're at that pH 6.5, you're seeing a much more vigorous root. You got better root hairs. At the lower pHs, it's not growing as deep. Think of drought management. Okay, if my roots don't go down really deep, they're not going to take advantage of any moisture that's stored down there. They're not going to get down there for the nutrients. So that's one of the things that, you know, we walk across the grasses all the time, but this is what's happening below the ground. And this is what's happening when you're to your grasses when you're not managing, you know, that pH properly. All right, so let's talk about some of the real world a little bit, about some of the things that you can do. This is actually in the county. They're grazing sheep. We work with this producer quite a bit, but he actually manages it. He puts the fertility down. He does the overseeding. So I'm going to try to help you go through some of that, what we're doing when we're looking at our pastures. Overgrazing is probably the most common issue that we run into. And that's really not, you either have, as I said before, you have too many animals, or you're not moving them, you're not rotating them enough on it. Undergrazing, again, if you don't have enough animals, what happens is they're not grazing it well enough and it gets coarse and stemmy. I wish I saw more of that in the county, but I don't. I see more overgrazing. And rotational grazing is something in the planting phase when you're laying out your pastures. A lot of people have a tendency to just put one large pasture in it. They don't break it into smaller units. And that actually hurts in terms of your forage production. So I think I have a slide here of a typical rotational. And again, this is an academic representation, but this is what we're trying to do. I have that sacrifice area, and we'll use that for areas in, say, the winter, or maybe I'm only going to turn animals out for, you know, 6 or 8 hours a day, then they're going to go into the sacrifice. But if you see, I have resting on here. And what we had done is we break these into units where one is the top one's in use. We'll graze that. And you don't want to let anything graze on grasses to less than 3 or 4 inches. If they're grazing down to less than 3 or 4 inches, you're putting that grass in stress. It's going to thin out and you're going to start having weed issues. So again, we try to go down to 3 or 4 inches, and then we'll move into the next one. Here says next to be grazed. We'll shut the top one down. We can go in there if we have to deal with, you know, spreading manure, or if we have to mow for weed control, what hasn't been grazed. You don't want weeds to go into flower. You know, the seed from the weed becomes next year's weed. So one of the things is when you shut it down, you go in there and mow. Now, if you have one large area, you don't have that flexibility a lot of times. And if you have to get into a herbicide use or something like that, you get in conflict where you want to keep the animals out of an area so you can go in for herbicide use. So the rotational grazing lends itself to that. And anything you can do to give a rest period for a forage area is going to help. So look at your own layout and see if there's something you can do. Ideally, you have multiple units, but even if you get into 1 or 2, just some sort of rotational grazing, you're going to be real happy with if you use fertility and some sort of rotational grazing. This is what's happening when you're overgrazing, and this is to show what happens with the poor grazing management. If you look on the left there where it's got poor grazing management, the roots aren't as deep, they're not as vigorous. And the roots are storing carbohydrates, which are actually being used to try to regenerate the top growth. So what you're doing is you're stressing that plant. You're forcing it to use its carbohydrate reserves to generate new top growth. So one of the things you want to do is you see get the most vigor up top on the one on the right is I'm limiting the amount of grazing on there and keeping a healthy root system. The one that's overgrazed, I'm continually stressing that root system and I'm using those carbohydrates. So that's what's happening when you're overgrazing. You may not see that, like I guess I said, the below ground portion, but you're going to see it on the top when you have increased weeds coming in and you're not getting the forage growth that you're looking for. All right, so if you want to go out and establish a new pasture, because now we say fall is for planting, we're in the heart of when you should be planting right now. So one of the things you have to keep in mind is if we are starting from scratch, you have to have a good seed bed, okay? Forage seed, the grass seeds we use are really small. We always talk about good seed to soil contact. So people will broadcast, on the top, and they're not going to get the establishment of the grasses that they would like. You get a shower or two, it dries out, the seed doesn't do well. Again, I want to talk about establishment versus renovation. Establishment would be starting from scratch, doing a new seeding. If you don't have access to a no-till seeder, or you're not working the ground, you're kind of in conflict with that seed to soil contact with it. You want to make sure you're buying good, high quality seed. And if you have a breeding program, or like with beef cattle or anything like that, you want to make sure if you're using fescues that it's endophyte free. There are endophytes that we put in turf varieties of fescues for disease and insect control, but we don't want those into anything we're using for livestock. So the landscape seed is not suitable, for that forage grazing. And keep your grazing mix simple, your pasture mix simple. There's a lot of things that are sold that are designed to be used from, Vermont down into, Virginia. They put a lot of different components in it. And the thought or the idea process from the marketing end is, if I put something that's going to grow for that wide range, we don't need all those things. So if you can get a mix on yourself, like keep a good productive grass, maybe it's orchard grass, a grazing fescue. You can put a legume in there if you want, depending on your operation, if you need, the protein or the higher feed value. If not, it's a lot easier to manage a pasture without a legume in it, because I have a broadleaf and a grass in it at that point. And that just confounds a lot of things in terms of weed management. So if you don't need the legume, my recommendation is not to put it in. You can deal with it probably with your supplemental feeds. And the other component is bluegrass. And why do I put bluegrass in a pasture? It's a sod former. It actually weaves and knits things together, and it keeps the soil in place. So that's always the other component that we'll always see in most of the pasture mixes. These are some of the cool season grasses, and we actually have this in a fact sheet. It's called Selecting Forage Species for Your Pasture. It's again on our publication section. This chart shows, what's drought tolerant, what's not drought tolerant, how well something does with low pH, its tolerance to frequent grazing. So if you're selecting some of the grasses, you can use this as a guide for what to pick. Now, again, as I said, we don't like Timothy in pastures because the growing point is at or near the surface. So we don't use that in our mixes. These are from a fact sheet. Again, this is from an equine science, but these are just some of the components or some of the recommendations that we have. Again, if you don't want the clovers, you don't have to put the clovers, but these are the components based on soil type. And if you notice on the poorly drained soils, they're recommending reed canary grass. Well, that comes with a couple of caveats, because some animals don't like reed canary grass. I've heard of others that do, but it's one that does really well in poorly drained soils. So you can look at some of the different mixes and figure out which you want to do. The ones that I recommend a lot are orchard grass, because a lot of the hay in this area has orchard grass. We're going to have that bluegrass component in there. Some of the others that do okay, even more so, perennial rye used to fade out in our area. We were at one point at the northern end, but as we're getting differences in temperatures and things, it's very much more persistent. Some people will use the perennial ryegrass in the mix. That's suitable. Some people will use brome grass. If you're looking at orchard grass for a grazing situation, there's a variety called tikapoo. And orchard grass is a clump grass, but the tikapoo grows a little bit more laterally. And we find that it's a better selection to use in pastures because of the growth habitat. So if you're looking for something with orchard grass, I think you might want to look at that tikapoo variety. And so the decision, this is the hard part that comes in, especially now we're in that situation, is how do I determine whether or not I need to do an overseeding? There's one fact sheet we have is using a string intercept method. Basically, you're laying a line out and you're counting the number of desirable grasses in there. Some people will take a square or a hoop, and you're trying to do an assessment of whether or not you have 50% desirable plant material, less than it. If you have less than it, you got to do a complete renovation where you're going in and I'm going to go in with either a no-till seeder, I'm going to go in and, disc it up and start over from scratch. That's kind of that threshold, that hallmark we use, the 50%. If I'm between 50 to 70% desirable, then we might go in with an overseeding. And one of the problems we have with overseeding, and a lot of people will say, I don't have access to a no-till drill or something. So they'll do a broadcast, and the amount of seed that you're going to get to survive is going to be reduced considerably with just, overseeding it, just doing a broadcast. So we a lot of times will recommend, can you get a shallow disc in there to just cut the surface a little bit? Can you take maybe even a York rake and scratch the surface? I got to get that seed in contact with some soil for it to actually have a fighting chance of germinating. So, just broadcasting that seed. And I've seen people take a 5-gallon bucket with a hand and just walk across it, and they're just spreading the seed. That's not the ideal way to do it. You got to get something where you can get some of that seed in contact with the soil. If you've got more than 70% desirable species, good job. You're doing what you should be doing, okay? Just keep up with the fertility management. Make sure that you're managing your grazing, and we'll talk about clipping and things like that in a little bit, but that's what you want to follow. So if you go out and you look and, hey, there's less than 50%, you've got probably a little bit of some work to do, and now is a good time to be doing that. It's a great time of year right now to be doing the overseeding, so that's something we should be doing right now. Let's say poisonous plants. I just throw this in there real quickly because how dry it's been, and there are concerns that you can have with poisonous plants. And the best way we deal with that is, number one, have a well-managed pasture, and don't believe that instinct is going to provide protection. We all know you can get an animal who's interested in just checking things out. They're curious. And this is the time when we have droughts where it becomes more of an issue, because a lot of times the poisonous plants are still green where everything else is dried down or it's not really growing. So you get somebody who's interested in investigating it, and that's where we run into the problem. 2 books I recommend that you get on hand. If you're going to manage a pasture, you should have these on your bookshelf. And one is Weeds of the Northeast. That will help you identify some of the weeds that we have. And Peterson's Wildflower Guide, right? It's one man's wildflowers, another man's weed. These are 2 of the core books I recommend you have for help for identification. Now, Cornell has a great poisonous plant page, which can give you the details of which plants are poisonous. The University of Pennsylvania has one also. There's a number of compounds typically in the plants, like alkaloids or things like that, which can actually cause problems. Some of the trees, we have a fact sheet, I think it's 938, it's poisonous plants in, I think it's equine pastures. There's a list of some of the plants that we can have problems with. Here's the thing, when we start talking about toxicity, we had John Mead, who used to be a extension weed specialist here years ago. And this is, if you're assessing something, it's how prevalent is that weed out there? How toxic is it? And that's why I mentioned that Cornell poisonous plant page and the desirability. And John always told us it's a function of these 3, whether or not you've got a problem out there. If something's very prevalent, very toxic, that becomes the overriding factor, even if the desirability is slight. So just because you identify a weed that is listed as a poisonous weed doesn't mean it's always fatal. I mean, some things are just irritants, things like that, but you want to become aware. Again, if you're managing livestock and you're managing pastures, I think you really have a duty to know what's out there, what's growing in your pasture. Where I typically see it is, it's not a huge threat, but it's more the marginal operation. Somebody who's new, they don't know what, you don't know what you don't know. That's what our extension director tells us all the time. And that when we have the drought conditions, so keep that in mind with it. Not to cause anybody to panic, but when you're managing your pastures, this is a good time of year. Do I have pokeweed out there? Do I have black cherry out there? Those are some of the common ones that we run into. You can run into nightshade. And one of the problems where we typically see them coming in, and I'll talk about it a little bit, is along the fence line here. You get birds who sit on your fence line, they sit on the fence rail, they deposit seeds, or maybe you're not taking care of it well. Things that grow over. So make sure that you maintain also along the outside of your fence. I think I'm leaving myself some time, Kate, so I guess we can stop sharing here. If you need to get a hold of me, that's actually my old email. It's now NJAES. It's not Rutgers.edu. I didn't catch that. Yeah. But that's the office phone number here if you need any assistance or help. And let me stop sharing. And
Thank you, Bill. Always difficult to cover these topics in an hour.
As I told Kate before, I usually cover this in 3 weeks. We have a 3-week class at Pasture School that we usually run because there's so much to cover on it. But the take home I wanted to give everybody is one of the easiest things you can do is the fertility right now and the overseeding. Those are 2 things that are actually you're in the prime season for. So, consider doing it now.
We do have a couple of questions in the chat. I want to go to Molly's question first, just because it's related to something you were just talking about. Okay. Molly was wondering about the percent cover when you're talking about 50 to 70 or above 70% cover.
Good question. Good question, Molly, because we're talking usually when we're talking cover, it's the amount of stems. Okay, so it's easier to do this if you read that fact sheet on the string intercept method, it's easier to do this early in the spring, but when are we seeding is now, because you can have one stem that grows up and it goes laterally, so it can be a misrepresentation of the cover with it. So it's usually by how many desirable individual plants are in there, the percent cover with it.
So spring is the best time to do that, but
yeah, spring is, or if it's just recently been cut and it's low,
okay,
then you can get a better feeling of what's going on out there. Most things, the problem that I've seen is the 70% one is definitely, I don't see that as much, but less than 50% we see a lot. If you start seeing a lot of weeds coming in there, if you're predominant by weeds, you probably have a problem.
It looks like your conversation on buttercup was very specific to Molly, because they posted another question. When you have a lot of buttercup in the early spring, it could kind of skew your cover, but
buttercup too is an interesting one. Buttercup, you want to cut it before it goes to flower. Buttercup management starts in March or April. If you're going to use a herbicide, we go out with like a broadleaf, like 2,4-D usually. And then what we try to do is we manage our grazing also, so we're not getting down too low. We're stressing the grasses. And then we also want to cut it before it flowers, because there's a lot of seed that gets produced in buttercup, which then becomes next year's buttercup.
So in Molly's case, where there's a lot of buttercup in the spring, but it's mostly desirable forage by the middle of the summer, that would still indicate there's a lack in grass production, because you are still having that weed come in.
Generally, and the other problem is buttercup is actually listed on the poisonous plants. There's ranunculuses in it, which is a problem. Generally, most horses I know avoid it, but
so a strategy to improve early season grass cover.
The fertility will probably go a long way in helping boost the grass production, and you can start to get out competing, get more competitive with it.
And it's probably a lot of crabgrass or other summer annuals that are coming in after the buttercup.
There's also a change in philosophy on crabgrass. Crabgrass, if you look in the animal science feeding tables, actually has a feed value. And I actually planted crabgrass for the first time 2 years ago as a hay. They're looking at it as a hay crop more and more. There are actually crabgrasses that are bred for forage. I think one's called Quick River, and there's a couple others. So one of the old time extension weed specialists said, it's a grass, it's got feeding value, and getting rid of a grass and a grass is a tough battle. So maybe it's one of those things where you accept it and, recognize that it does have a feeding value.
Sure. And just focusing on the other practices to improve the early season grazing there.
Yeah, I see the one question: how soon after overseeding can you put horses? You're not going to like my answer on this. Most of the horse people don't like my answer on this one. Generally, we're trying to get in anywhere from 6 to 9 inches of regrowth to get a root system established. because again, when I showed that slide, what happens if there's not a big enough carbohydrate reserve on the roots, you're stressing the grass. So if you put them back in too early, you're stressing that grass immediately. And that's usually one of the biggest conflicts that I have. And I know yeah, 6 to 9. If I start from scratch, that's what we want, is 6 to 9 inches of growth to get it established. And I have never found somebody who owns horses who can accept that one. So it's a constant battle. But if you can get at least 4 inches of growth, you'd be better off than you would be, with just putting them out really soon.
That's another reason why having that rotational option is great.
Yeah.
You can renovate certain areas that are in rest rather than the whole area at once.
Yeah, and the advice we usually give is if you're doing renovations and stuff, if you have rotational, you don't have to do the whole property at once. It could be this year, I'm going to do this paddock or this turnout or this pasture. Next year, I'm going to try the next one, just give things a chance to rest. And I'm the academic here, so I'm giving you the textbook examples. Anytime I go out to a farm, there's a real world, like, horses aren't compatible, or I don't have enough, I don't have enough land for all the animals that I have. So there's always some overriding factor, that comes in. But we work with what we have. What I'm giving you is anything you could do to even tweak or slightly adapt some of this is going to help your pasture quite a bit.
Phil, there was a question earlier on I don't want to miss. Seems to be something that we talk about more often now about wetlands, and when you have a pasture area that is on ground that might be classified as wetlands.
The issue usually comes with that is what was its prior use or what it was taking out of. If you're getting in an area that is wetland, a lot of times I'll refer people to the NRCS to see whether or not it is a regulated area. It's the change in use which triggers a lot of the laws that come in an area. If it's actively managed as a pasture and has been a pasture, and I used to do this stuff as a consultant years ago. I'm out of the game a little bit, so I'm not sure if it still applies, but it was what the start of the Clean Water Act used to be a big, big demarcation in the law. But if you're managing something that has always historically been, you can still do things with it. If you just start establishing or starting something new in a wetland area, then it's a regulated activity.
And so you could reach out to the Natural Resource Conservation Service.
I often do, just to make sure that you're on solid footing, is because they deal with it a little bit more. They interact, I know, sometimes with the DEP, and it's a lot easier to make that phone call in the beginning than if somebody says, hey, they just cleared this and put a pasture in or did something like that.
And Molly has the question that everybody asks us, where can you get a no-till drill to seed your pastures?
Yeah. It's not usually the Ag Extension Program, Molly. It's usually the conservation districts who have them, rent them out. The question, we get frustrated with this one too. If I could buy one and rent it out, I might do pretty well with it. The Cape Atlantic District used to have one. I don't know if they still do. I don't know if the Burlington District has one. Some of the conservation districts have them. So it's worth a call there with it. But finding one, sometimes that's usually the holy grail, finding a problem. We are located in the Pine Barrens, so it's very sandy.
So there's a question about fast tracking soil organic matter building.
The problem is in the sandy soils, you have such rapid breakdown with it that the pore space is there, they're oxygenated. It actually facilitates breakdown of the organic matter. So that becomes one of the problems with it. It is going to be a slow road to get, for you're happy to get a 1/4 inch, or 1/4% in the sandy areas increase in organic matter. It's very difficult. And I see Bob's talking about the North Jersey RC&D has a no-till. Bob, I don't know if does that go anywhere? Because I know the South Jersey one, I believe, does not have one.
Yeah, there was the Cape Atlantic district that did have one, and we're just trying to get to the bottom of,
Where it
whether
is.
it's available.
Yeah, sometimes I know these things, they get lost track of, and it's up in somebody's barn and they forget where it is and then they find it again.
I'll have to reach out to the North Jersey RC&D. It says it requires pickup, but it doesn't necessarily say,
Okay.
you know,
There's generally there's definitely a need for them. I mean, I can't tell you how many calls in a year I get for somebody looking for one. Trying to find a drill that's a rental.
thanks for sharing that, Bob. Are there any other questions for Bill? Anything you wanted us to dive into a little bit more in our last couple minutes here?
Hopefully you're still all awake.
If not, I'm going to share the link to our survey, our post-webinar survey in the chat. It would be really appreciated if you could take a few minutes to complete the survey and let us know your feedback on the presentation and what topics you'd like to learn about more in the future. You might have seen, a lot of you joined on a little bit later, but our next webinar in October is going to be featuring our marine extension agent, Doug Zemeckis, who's going to be talking about fishing for sustenance. So a little bit of a different topic, not crop production or land management, but more about fishing and how to, provide a little bit for yourself with those resources. I see Molly's question here. Is the pasture class online? So Bill, maybe you can talk about that since you're going to be one of the presenters, and I'll share the information in the chat as well as in our post webinar email.
Yeah, we have upcoming a drought management I guess it's a webinar. It's online on the 22nd. That's only because of the high nitrate concentrations that can be in forages and stuff. We're going to do a testing program. The Department of Ag is going to announce a testing program for that. The other thing that we've done, and I'm trying to gauge interest in whether there's interest in it again or not. We used to do a pasture school. We haven't run one in a couple of years, but it would be 3 weeks. It's like one night, over a 3-week period. And if there's enough interest in something like that, I'm sure I could reach out to my colleagues and we could run one again.
Perhaps if everyone could express their interest in the survey, then we can get that information back to Bill and his colleagues. I've included the link here to the drought webinar that's going to be hosted next Thursday by the Department of Ag and Cooperative Extension. And we can count Molly in for a pasture class. Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Bill, for your excellent presentation and taking some time to answer all those questions. We'll see you back hopefully in October, and I'll send out registration information for that in the next week or so.
Did we move from a Tuesday for October?
The October webinar is still going to be on Tuesday, but instead of the second Tuesday, it's going to be the third due to a conflict with our department meeting.
Yeah, so it will be a Tuesday, but it's not going to be the second Tuesday as usual.